over the last couple of days, we've talked a lot about some challenges of the interconnection of IBRs to the grid. This panel will share some of their ideas on what you can do to address some of those challenges. So our panel includes Enoch Davies, the Manager of Reliability Monitoring, Katie Rogers, the Manager of Reliability Assessments, and Donovan Crane, the Senior Engineer of Standards Development.
All right. I don't think we're getting to the slides yet. I can't seem to click through them. I don't know if there's anything that needs to happen. Go. Awesome. Thank you. So that's done. All right. So I just thought I would kick us off with a little image of what we have going into the future. So as you can see, the resource mix has changed, all based on color. But as you can tell, back in 2010, there was hardly any solar. That's the yellow at the very top. And over time, it's becoming more and more of a thing for the Western Interconnection out to 2045, where it's one of our bigger resources that we're depending on. And that is I just wanted to make that clear. And so this is something we'll hear about more later, but this is information that we post on our website in our system data portal. I think it's interesting. There's a bunch of other information out there that I think is also useful, where we talk about so this is the resource side. There's also information about the loads. There's all sorts of interesting information, but put a plug for the system performance data portal. And this is one of the graphics out there that shows the resource change over time. So jumping into the next slide. Try to be patient. Slides are still not changing. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. There we go. Awesome. So I thought I would so we touched on this a little bit yesterday. You heard about the Palmdale Roost event. You can see that on the top row. And I just thought I'd go through a quick timeline of what has happened, IBR related events over time. So I mentioned the Blue Cup fire, 2016. It's been a minute since that happened. We still have some of the challenges that we saw in the Blue Cup fire. So that sort of kicked everything off. We saw a big essentially what happened is we saw a big change in frequency. Like I mentioned, if you were in the large load discussion, we use frequency to help us understand or identify changes like generators tripping or load coming online or tripping. So we saw a big frequency dip and we said, hey, we don't know why. Investigated, found out solar just evaporated for an amount of time. Canyon 2 fire 2017 happened. Same thing. A lot of lessons learned. Still tried to work on things to get people to, embrace it, get changes made. Keep going down the line. Palmdale Roost, another event. Heard a lot about that yesterday. And then Odessa, as you can see, that's in here several times, and that's a very exciting area of Texas. But we've identified all sorts of things out of that. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but there's new modeling requirements coming as a result of the Odessa events. We're talking about electromagnetic transient models being required for people to do interconnection studies, all sorts of interesting things. And then, as you can see, we have some of our more recent events where in Southwest Utah, we had some same sort of thing. Saw an issue on the transmission grid, and it affected solar plants. And then obviously we got the last couple of battery or BESS battery energy storage systems. But that's what those last two are. And that's been the most recent events where we saw unexpected results, unexpected outcomes based on something that happened on the transmission system. So it's not new and it's hasn't gone away yet. We haven't fixed it. So there's still opportunities for us to deal with it. So I thought I'd jump into some of the models. And as I mentioned, we'll talk more about the EMT stuff. But so in WEC, as hopefully everybody's aware, we've got our approved dynamic models, and we generally require those for our interconnection-wide model application. So if you're going to use that put it in a base case, a WEC base case, then it's got to be one of the standard library models. There's also user-defined models. We actually recommend people use these for things like interconnection studies. We think it's a better model. I mean, it's more precise, and they tend to be a black box. So it makes us very nervous to try and put them in our cases, but they are useful and should probably be used for things like interconnection studies. So you get, a more precise response from the IBR as you're trying to study it to interconnect it. And then, as I mentioned, the Odessa event has shown the light on electromagnetic transient models and the need for them. It's really become apparent that we need these more complex, more precise models that really can demonstrate the exact operation of the controls for things like IBRs. So, and there's a bunch of standard development going on about that. So I don't know if Donovan will talk much about that, but that's certainly something that's on the horizon that I think there will be requirements for everybody to do something in the EMT environment. And I guess I'll just put a plug out there. WEC is trying to figure out what we want to do as far as EMT goes. If there's a role for us to, collect data or put together subsystems or something like that. So we're having a workshop in mid-November. If you check our website, you can see that there. And we'd really like to get transmission planners, planning coordinators, and obviously anybody else who's interested there to help us frame and figure out how we're going to help industry, what we can do to help industry be successful with the new requirements and, making sure that we stay reliable and do the right interconnection studies and all that kind of stuff. So diving a little bit deeper into the approved dynamic models. As I mentioned, we require these for the WEC-wide WEC-wide cases. And in general, most people start with those for doing their interconnection studies. We also, as per several recommendations and other things like guidelines that NERC has put out, we really recommend that people take those dynamic models that we're requesting and compare them to things like user-defined models or EMT models to make sure that they're giving a reasonable response. And you're about to see, a version of what reasonable response means, but essentially it really boils down to it needs to look similar enough. And there's a lot of judgment in there. There's no precise result that tells you that, but we're really looking for people to make sure that they're validating their models, they understand it, and it really is essential for us to have good IBR models, kind of like we talked about with the load. We need to have good representation so that we can predict what's going to happen, and then you all and everybody can use those models to have a good feel for what's going to happen. So we're not having to go out and, like in the olden days, go out, throw a wire over a transmission line, see what happens. That was a simulation, right? Hopefully we're past that. Hopefully we're to the point where we can do a computer model and see what happens and have good confidence that we predicted the future and we can take care of whatever mitigation needs to happen. So as I mentioned, here's an example. So at WEC, we don't do interconnection studies, so I don't have any examples of where we took a simulation and compared it to a model prediction or a real-time data and compared it to model. But what we do have is transmission. We look at system model validation cases at WEC regularly. We do at least a couple a year where we take PMU information from like the operators and we compare that to our simulations. So here's an example of what we called a pretty good match, where we saw a big outage. I think this was a generator outage of Palo Verde. And we looked at these transmission lines and we saw a pretty good match of what we expected to see versus what they actually saw real time. So as I mentioned, this isn't what you're going to do because you're probably not going to be looking at transmission lines when you're trying to model IBRs, but it was the example I had. So as I mentioned before, we want to compare simulation results to system measurements. And then that's one approach. And that's probably the one that I recommend to most people. There's also generator testing. I'm sure you're all familiar with the mod standards that require that. That's another good way, right? You stage a test, have it do a step change. You can see what happens, compare that to your model, and you can decide whether it's good enough or not, or if you need to tweak the model. And then finally, as I mentioned before, comparing simulation results to simulation results with the PSCAD type, EMT type models sort of being the benchmark for most simulations. So diving a little deeper, we have the generator testing standards. So we've got mod 25 through 27. those exist. At WEC, we also have the WEC generator testing program. It's a guideline, not required, but I think it does lay out some very good approaches for how you can test your generators. I've given links to the guideline, and then there's also a requirements document that tells you essentially how we would think that the test could be performed. And then going to the model and validation subcommittee, we've talked a little bit. I think it's been mentioned a couple times during this meeting, like things like grid forming. Well, there is now a model for grid forming generators. I don't know how many of you all have grid forming IBRs on your system or are starting to require them. But if you do, there's a model for you to use. And if there's other models you need, the model and validation subcommittee is the place to go to make those requests. I think, being part of the large load discussions earlier, that's another thing we're working on with them, is trying to get some large load models like, hey, here's a model for crypto miner. Okay, that's great. Now we can plug that in where it's appropriate. And then I just thought I would share, everybody likes pictures. I don't know if people like these kind of pictures because they're very technical, but that one of the approaches is to, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is to take, fault recordings and see how your model compares. So that's option 2 in the requirements document, sort of lays out how you would do that, what that would look like, and gives you some steps to follow to make sure you can accomplish that. And then finally, I think this is my last slide. We've got some NERC documents where they've made recommendations, and I alluded to these earlier. These are documents where it says, hey, if you are interconnecting IBRs, here's some things you should ask for. Here's some things that you should require them to provide you before you interconnect those. So I provided links to those 2 documents that are both useful for that, and they give a lot of recommendations on things that you should expect. And then I just thought, to help people, here's some terms you've heard. Momentary cessation. That's where your generator, no fault, no problem, just stops injecting current because that's the setting, and it's going to do that. There's also a phase jump. That was one of the causes in one of the reports that I talked about earlier, where you saw the fault happen and the IBR controls thought that it jumped phases. So, 3-phase system, it's on phase A. It thought that it jumped to phase B. That caused it to trip. And then IEEE P2100 is a standard that's been being developed for, several years now. I think they're on a 2nd or 3rd version. But it's really trying to, canonize what you should require IBRs to do and how they should perform. And then grid forming, that's a term a lot of people throw around. It's essentially where that IBR controls voltage and it controls frequency and voltage. It doesn't take that from the system. I don't know if that's a great explanation. And then I also threw this one in fast frequency response. Something we could talk about later is, there's thoughts that people should be including these in like their interconnection requirements. Like, hey, you should require it to have fast frequency response when you install a new IBR. Some people call it synthetic inertia. Most don't think that's a good way to talk about it, but it is out there, and you may hear that term of synthetic inertia, but I like to think of it as fast frequency response. I think, one more. This is great. So as we've talked about in many other discussions, there's lots of ongoing work. So eSig has a lot of great information out there. They've got a lot of working groups where they're working on information that can be shared, can be used, make recommendations, that kind of thing. The YRAB, Western Interconnection Reliability Regional Advisory Board, has been working on this harmonization of IBR interconnection requirements, and they're trying to develop an interconnection-wide document that we all could use for our interconnection requirements. We're involved in that effort. They're coming to our technical committees to make sure that happens, make sure that there's good coverage. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to me. I can definitely get you in touch with the folks putting that together, and we can get you involved. And then, finally, there's lots of changes that happen as things get built. And one of the big things that comes out of a lot of the documents that I've seen from NERC and other places is typically what you start as your plan gets changed. So you're going to see, a different vendor provide your inverters, and then you're going to see a different vendor provide this other part. And you have to make sure that you're adapting. So you're going to start with a model. You're going to do all your interconnection studies with this model, and then you're going to have you need to have a different model that shows here's what we actually built and how it functions. And we probably need to see both of those in, like WEC base cases in your interconnection studies. And I just wanted to make sure that, people are thinking about that. There's probably, it's not you get a model and you're done. You really need to make sure that you're following up and getting multiple models and build that in your interconnection approach.
So here's just some of the analysis that we have done or are doing. So we have a couple WEC assessments that we've done that are related to IBRs. So the impact of high DER assessment looked at how that can increase the dependency on IBRs. There's the changes in system inertia study, which looked at how the increased amount of IBRs can lead to decreased system inertia and therefore result in system instability under certain conditions. The changes in grid strength, this one actually found that we just have a huge lack of short circuit modeling. And so it just makes it difficult for us to even study that at this point. And then we also have the grid forming inverter assessment. And that really determined that if you move from grid following to grid forming technology, it is a significant improvement in the interconnection wide frequency response. And then Enoch already kind of plugged the system data portal, but just to do it again, if you like pretty graphs like this or are interested in more data, we do provide a lot in the system data portal, and we're continuing to expand the information that is available there too. So if you have other questions, we might be able to answer them via our system data portal. Then just to talk about, we've got our WEC technical committees, and so there's a lot of discussions that are happening there as well. For example, the risk register, we've been moving from this concept of risk priorities to a risk register, which is a bit more robust. And so, for example, there's at least 7 currently risks on that risk register that speak to IBRs. This is obviously a bullet list of 3, so it is not all-encompassing of all 7, but here are just some examples of the risks that we've identified that are related to IBRs. We're also starting to look at the different kinds of data we get, and are they agreeing with one another? So, for example, some of our loads and resource data is indicating that our inertia is occurring at one level. However, our base cases are not necessarily agreeing with that when we run the base cases. So we're trying to look at why is there that discrepancy that we're seeing between those two sets of information. We're also linked is the current off-nominal frequency load shedding plan, and we're just evaluating if that needs to be updated just with the increase in IBRs and how that affects load shed due to underfrequency. And then there's also the short circuit modeling committee, and they're really looking at how they found that IBRs are kind of being ignored in the protection models. And so they're looking at how do we make the right adjustments so that they're appropriately considered.
Sweet. All right. So now we're gonna jump in and talk a little about standards on this. And I think it's something that it's kind of bumped around a lot, right? If we're talking about, anything when it's the reliability security, there's a standard that applies to it. I wanted to take this back a little bit higher level on this and start thinking, standards from a slightly different perspective. From this one, we operate and work in an industry where words and definitions matter, right? So first coming into this, I would read some documents and think, well, there's a lot of weird capital letters in here. We should probably give this to our tech editor and have him take those out. Maybe someone's got a stray pinky that words and sentences are capitalized that shouldn't be, and then realizing that they're capitalized for a reason because they matter, and there needs to be specific definitions for that so we're all on the same page. Leading to this, the clarity and this understanding is a must for everyone. Everyone who operates, works with the grid, everyone who regulates the grid, everyone who touches on it. We all need to be able to understand when we say certain words. We have definitions associated with that that we can play from the same playbook. The pipe dream that would be that everybody has the same understanding, but I don't think I can get my neighbor to have the same understanding of standards and how the grid operates as I would. Nobody seems to really care in the neighborhood what I do for a job until the power goes out, and then my door's the first one knocked on, and I indicate that my lights are also off, and I can't tell exactly what's going on. But to take a different approach from just diving into a standard and saying, the process and procedure, we're going to do a different exercise. And we're going to start with the question, if it wants to go.
Dramatic pause.
Yeah, dramatic pause. What is a motorcycle? And it seems a little bit off, but like it's one of those like, oh, if you see a motorcycle, you think, oh, I understand what a motorcycle is. Some of us in this room might think, oh, Ducati, maybe a Harley, a Honda. That's what a motorcycle is, right? We can have that, it depends on who you talk to. But if someone to ask you, define a motorcycle or tell me what that is to someone who's never heard of it before, we may have different definitions on what a motorcycle is. So for this exercise, we're going to go ahead and use Merriam-Webster with an automotive vehicle with two inline wheels. And for, again, all of us or most of us in the room, we go, yeah, that probably makes sense, right? That describes the motorcycle, the picture I have in my head of what a motorcycle is. And if we were a spelling bee or a little bit more in depth, we can use using it in a sentence. We can say Evansville is located in Vanderburgh County, which also has a wheel tax of $20 for motorcycles, passenger vehicles, and heavy trucks. So interestingly enough, on this one, there's also a monetary incentive to know what a motorcycle is. With that, the fun exercise is we're going to, as members of society, I think we've all agreed we have a common enemy, and that enemy is CAPTCHA. Nobody loves this. Whenever one of these comes up, it's never, yes, I get to try to find the things it's asking me to do. So this one, based solely off the definition that we had previously had, do you feel confident choosing the images in the picture? And I think that we can look at this and we're like, oh, sure, there's a motorcycle dead center. That's awesome. That's probably what most of us had in our head. And you look at the middle left and go, well, there's nothing in that picture. The middle right, there might be, but I'd feel fairly confident saying probably not a motorcycle. I'd look to the top right and think, well, that looks like the back end of a motorcycle, and it seems like a safe assumption, so I'd probably choose that square. Bottom middle, that's a plant. The bottom right, that's a car that, we can assume that as well, the back end of a car. I wouldn't select that one. And then there's the bottom left-hand corner. Is that a motorcycle? I'd call it a scooter, but according to our definition of an automotive vehicle with two inline wheels, that may fall under a motorcycle. And then I start questioning, well, do I know what a motorcycle is? What does the robot want me to click on? And then tongue in cheek, looking at the top left corner, if I was or knew a good enough lawyer, based solely off the picture, I might be able to argue that's a motorcycle. I see two inline wheels and I know that's an automotive vehicle. So you could probably fight that for a little bit if you really, really wanted to. Is the definition clear? Did we have a shared understanding of what a motorcycle is with this? And would that definition bring in scooters, e-bikes, electric motorcycles, and this thing that I Googled, automotive vehicle with two inline wheels? Apparently, that is also a motorcycle. So with that, it's important to have the definition. If we were going to tie just really quickly back to IBRs a little bit, if my 9-year-old comes up and says, Dad, I heard you're saying IBR a lot on your meetings or inverter based, what is that? Say, a solar panel. For her definition, a solar panel, you would probably consider this, or the wind turbines. I would probably not use that definition if it was during an audit or if I was writing a standard. I wouldn't put that as the definition. So it's important that we have that clarity of what it is that we're talking about. And this is the first step that Jamie touched on a little bit as well, is when we're introducing standards or there's new technology that we need to incorporate into this, the first thing everyone needs to be able to agree on is what are we talking about so that we can then move on to the directions. We need that specificity. We need to know if someone reads the definition, has the definition in front of them, this is what we're talking about, and we share it. So for the next CAPTCHA, we're just going to use the definition of an automotive vehicle with a gasoline-powered engine with only two inline vehicles. And this one should be a little bit easier. we can probably assume it's safe enough. I mean, if you really wanted to argue it, we might be able to say, well, I don't see the second wheel. But I think for this example, it's fair enough to say this is a motorcycle. But are there any other questions now, even with our definition, that you might ask of that CAPTCHA when it says select all the squares with motorcycles? And if there are none, click skip. Seems a bit easy, right? You're like, oh, sweet. I see the motorcycle. I don't have a question of is it a motorcycle? I just have to select all the ones with motorcycles. So pretty straightforward squares. We know almost 100% that's a motorcycle. But is the nub of the kickstand what they may be looking for as well? Is that a motorcycle? How about the back of the basket? Is that a motorcycle? What's the robot looking for? Or the fun question, how much of the tire needs to be in the square to count as a motorcycle? So going off this one, in addition to these clear definitions that we have, once we know what a motorcycle is, we need these clear and consistent directions. If someone reads this, well, standard says, the X entity shall do, whatever it says after that, we need it to be clear so that you can read it and know what it is you're looking for. Or when we say this is an IBR, or this is a facility, or this is a generator, are we talking about, we don't want the questions of, well, it's a part that's touching the IBR, so technically is it, or this facility, like what counts as that? We need the clarity on our directions and what it is that we're being asked to do. We could do something, there could be a better direction that says, select the squares with any part, no matter how small, of a motorcycle. And we could even take the next step, any part of a motorcycle or anything touching a motorcycle. Because we could, again, argue, is a basket the motorcycle, or is it just considered the part of the motorcycle because it's touching it? There's lots of questions that we can go down the rabbit hole. So when making these standards, when these drafting teams are getting together, and they're given what we sometimes, depending on our work and where we're at in our companies, we think, oh, I understand this. It shouldn't be that hard to make a definition. It shouldn't be that hard to give. I know what needs to be done. We've been operating the grid. I know what needs to be done. How do you define that? How do you write that in a clear and consistent way that makes it so anyone of the hundreds of companies, thousands of employees that provide power, that supply that to our modern society that, in the West, we have 80 million people relying on, and overall in the North American continent, 400 million plus people that don't realize that we need to know these definitions, that the definition of an IBR, or in this case, a motorcycle, may be powering their home. So Jamie had talked about some of the standards with the 901 projects going on. We'll bring this back to some of these standards and why this is important to know those first two steps, the definitions and also the directions. When it comes to FAC 1, when it's coming through, that's looking for these enhanced facility interconnection requirements for the IBRs. But there's a lot of directions that need to be considered with this. Now it's reactive power and voltage control requirements that need to be clear about not only how it's using IBRs, how IBRs play into this, but also active power frequency response requirements, response to transmission, system abnormal conditions, protection directions, modeling data requirements, measurement data, test and verification requirements. This seemingly simple task of identifying what an IBR is and then giving directions on how those integrate becomes pretty detailed pretty fast. And we have 50, 75, 100 years of knowing how spinning inertial generation works. It seems pretty simple. Now we have something that's slightly different that we don't have hundreds or 50 or tens of years. It's fairly new that we now need to bring into standards. FAC 2 is also up on the table for development, modifying this as necessary to require TPs and PCs to study aggregate distribution connected generation. It's a little bit more. What does that mean? What is a DER? How much do we need to pay attention to? What is that nub of the kickstand of the motorcycle that they're looking for? More requirements on this. TPs, PCs, develop the process for assessment and assessing conformity with applicable interconnection requirements. And down in the further, it says, for IBR facilities seeking to make a qualified change. And I know that there's probably at least a handful in this room that went, define qualified change. There's more definitions. So it's not just the one definition inside of we need to bring in IBRs. We need to bring in large loads potentially for other groups that have talked. There's other things it needs to play with and make it so it's clear. For the new 901 standards, now we're in milestone 4 with these planning studies. I wanted to highlight the standards affected, and you can go, if you read the SARs and on the project pages at NERC's website, they'll have these standards that are affected. These are the ones that, we know that this will probably get brought into the project and we need to address that. So this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 standards that touch each other, that say IBR, that now need to be considered in planning studies. And those are just the ones that are for sure going to be affected by this. Then now we're asking a drafting team that represents hundreds of companies, thousands of people, to come to a conclusion, an agreement of how that will be integrated into standards. And it's a little bit easier to, I already know it's difficult. Like in my family, we've got me, my wife, and my 2 girls. And when it's, hey, we need to agree on where we're going to go for dinner, or we need to agree on, was that a good movie or not that we watched? We have, between the 4 of us, about 5 opinions, depending on who saw it and what my youngest thinks in that minute. I don't envy the drafting teams that now have to work and not only work amongst the 12 or so drafting team members, but compile hundreds of industry comments and try to come together to say, this is the definition that we all agree on, and here's a direction that we all understand. It's a little bit more detailed than a CAPTCHA, where you can just say, well, if I don't do this right the first time, I'll get another shot at the CAPTCHA. It would be a little bit different if it said, please select all of the squares with the motorcycle, and if you don't do that, there may be a fine for that. I'd be a little bit more hesitant to even make that decision. This is another one, the second 901 that's coming through here, the 2025-03. And what was interesting about this, I wanted to point out, was there's the standards that are affected, that we know they're affected, and it's listed on the NERC website on the project page of, FAC 11 and the IRO, PRC, and top 1 and 2. But inside the SAR, they also said or noticed that additional standards could potentially be affected and brought in all of these standards. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 standards that a drafting team has to consider and give clarity and consistency across all of those. It's not an easy lift for the drafting teams. They're trying their best. They're trying as hard as they can to use as much industry knowledge as possible, the historic knowledge, the experience of the SMEs, and also bring in new technology as we're learning and trying to understand that as the models look different, as the behavior is ever so slightly different for new technologies that comes on. They have to then apply this across standards that are enforceable, mandatory, and that millions of people rely on. I think it was a previous workshop that Steve Noss, one of the VPs at WEC, had stated there was a time in standards where they thought, nailed it, got it, we're done, we think we've covered everything. And what we're finding out now is we're not close to that. And as technology speeds up, as IBRs are coming on, as large load becomes a new thing that needs to be considered, as there are technologies outside of the grid that will affect the grid, we're not super close on having exactly what it is that we need. But working through this, and it depends on involved stakeholders. It involves involved industry experts to get involved with this and listen to this, to know what's going on with the standards development, to be able to lend expertise where you can and help build that as we go through. So not going through red lines of standards, but giving kind of a high level view of this is the 2 biggest things when considering standards: clarity of definition and clarity and consistency of directions that are asked for. It's an ongoing process, and it's fun to be part of. It's frustrating at times, but this is something that affects millions, and it's important work. So with that, I think that we will be opening it up for questions. Perfect. Super clear, super consistent. Glad we nailed that.
Everybody gets a long break.
We've had an online question come in. Registering your IBR is one thing, but what specific reliability standards and requirements are being assigned to that registration? Are all the current O&P and SIP standards going to be updated to apply applicability for IBRs, or are there new standards that will need to be drafted?
Yes. So the standards that are there, if you look into the applicability section, it tells you what functional entity they're applicable to. It's not necessarily just, this IBR is what's applicable to, but it's, the functional entity, a GOP. We have the new category 1, category 2. So you would see, do you fall into that? If you are like category 1 or category 2 GOP that's listed in the applicability section, yes, it could be applicable to you. And then it'll go further on what parts of that may be applicable. They're not carved out specifically saying, we're going to bring everything over to say IBRs, but if it could be affected, if it's a GOP applicability, then yeah, they're looking at how that would be brought in as applicable. And there's the potential, like with the current standards that we have, where this is a great list of, these are current standards that are being brought up to how do IBRs integrate into this? How can they be made more clear? There may be standards that we don't know about yet as they're working through these. A lot of the FERC orders or the SARs, you'll see the options given will say something to the effect of modify, update, or create reliability standards as needed. There's no guarantee that a new standard needs to be made if we can update one, or we might need to have one that's completely different that addresses IBRs. So short, yes, they will be applicable. And the long is, it depends, it breaks down, but you can see that if you read the standards into where they are applicable, it's listed in that applicability section.
IBR modeling mentioned PRC 28, 29, and 30. Is that more oriented to the operations horizon to see how they behave during an outage or relay misoperations?
Can you read the question one more time?
IBR modeling mentioned PRC 28, 29, and 30. Is that more oriented to the operations horizon to see how they behave during an outage or relay misoperations?
I don't know. I mean, certainly both of those matter, but I'm not sure on those specific standards how that applies. If there's a relay misoperation, yes, you definitely have to report it. I think that's a different standard though than one of those three. Yeah, sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd probably say something like the drafting teams as they're working on these, those are considerations that are brought in on how it should be addressed. There's not necessarily writing like this is exactly what you can read the SARs when they go in there and this is what the intent of it is. But, I would encourage as many people as possible to just observe some of these drafting team meetings, see the conversations that go on, the questions that they're asking themselves. Because sometimes it's asking like, well, how did you get to this point in a standard? And without saying, well, for the last month, I can give you the last 30 drafting team meetings and how we went through all the iterations. But that I would say, yes, it's probably considering both of those in some manner as they would.
Looks like James might save us. Save away, James.
I'm going to attempt to give some insight on that. So if there's a protection system misoperation, that's going to go under PRC 4. 28 is going to be your monitoring, very similar to PRC 2. PRC 29, if you're going to have if there's a performance issue, very similar to PRC 4 in your protection. So, and then PRC 30 is going to be like your corrective action plan within PRC 4 for a protection system misoperation. What are you doing to make sure that you're not going to have that performance issue in the future? PRC 30 is your corrective action plan. So those three standards are very specific to IBRs.
Thanks, James. Awesome. Oh. Not getting enough
So
signals.
Mr. Davies had the pleasure of being on the large load panel and this. So question for you, how are you going to reconcile the large load modeling and the IBR modeling to coordinate, the different kinds of characteristics of both of these?
Yeah, and I've been in part of many conversations, and it'd be great if we could just attack one problem at a time, but you all keep messing that up for us. So, yeah, as I mentioned, we have the model and validation subcommittee. They've developed some, I'm not going to call them perfect. It's a work in progress, some IBR models that I think are pretty effective, at least in that standard library. And we are asking them to also develop large load models. And then, as we've mentioned in several of our discussions about large loads, I think one of our big challenges there is knowing what we need to ask for, asking for it, and getting it. And we're at the early stages of exploring what we need to ask for. I'll put another plug in for the large load NERC alert. I think that's a ton of information, probably more than any of you want to be giving to anybody. But I'm hopeful that it's going to give us a real clear, detailed look at what we need to be asking for going forward so that we can get the information we need. But yeah, at the end of the day, we got to be improving the models for everything, making sure that we're getting the data that we need to make sure that the models are accurate. Need to be doing like we talked about for the validation, the generator testing. I'm sure there might be something similar for loads where we want to look at like their reactions after a fault so we can compare and see if that jives with what we saw in reality versus what our models said. There could be lots of opportunities for us to be exploring that. And as I mentioned, Blue Cup fire happened almost 10 years ago, and we're still battling getting updated models from all of the inverter-based resources and making sure that we've got those captured. There's nothing wrong with having things like momentary cessation, but we need our model to demonstrate it, and we just haven't gotten there quite yet. So really hopeful that we'll be able to put that one behind us and maybe focus more on, things like the large loads. But anything anybody else wants to add?
I'll just say too, we recognize that like the data we're looking for, it's not like we think somebody is sitting there holding it and saying, no, you can't have it. And I mean, we're even trying to figure out like, who do we need to be asking? Is it entities? Is it BAs? Is it developers? Like where do we even get the right information from? And we're, at least with large loads, so early on in that, either your assistance in helping us figure that out or your grace as we try to figure that out and maybe make some missteps along the way. But hopefully we'll get there. But I mean, I know MVS does have a list of models that they're trying to get to, and you just can't do everything at the same time. So it's some of it just takes time for us to get there. Jimmy, are we released?
Can we go?
All right, Jimmy said we're okay. So
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.